The door to Dr. Michael Reynolds' office opened with a soft, practiced click, a sound as routine as the calm that settled over him before each session. For 20 years, this room had been his sanctuary, a carefully curated space of muted earth tones, leather-bound books, and the faint, clean scent of old paper and brewed tea. It was a testament to his life's work, creating order out of emotional chaos. He was a cartographer of the human heart, and this room was his observatory. When Thomas Baker entered, he seemed to carry the city's gray afternoon chill with him. He looked more diminished than in their previous sessions, the shadows under his eyes no longer smudges but deep, violet hollows. His gaze was distant, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the room's soundproofed walls, as if carrying a weight so immense he could no longer even name it. Michael settled into his worn leather armchair, the familiar creak a quiet comfort. "Thomas," he began, his voice even and low, "how have you been since we last spoke?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. His hands, restless and pale, fidgeted with the zipper of his jacket. He took a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to catch in his throat, and then, looking directly at the floor, he spoke. "I need to get something off my chest, doctor." His voice was a murmur, almost as if he were afraid of the words himself. Michael simply nodded, his pen poised over a fresh page in his notebook. He gave his patients the one thing the world so often denied them: silence and the space to fill it. "I met someone," Thomas began, the words tumbling out now. A mixture of exhilaration and shame, the connection. It was immediate, like nothing I've ever felt. He finally looked up, and in his eyes, Michael saw the classic conflict of a man caught between desire and conscience. "She's older, and she's married." "At first, it was just talking," Thomas explained. "Meetings in quiet, anonymous cafes where they would speak for hours. Then came the shared walks, the accidental brushing of hands, and finally, the inevitable turning point. It had spiraled into an affair, a relationship he admitted was fundamentally wrong, yet one from which he was already powerless to break free." Michael just listened. He jotted down keywords, as he always did: immediate connection, guilt, powerlessness. He encouraged Thomas to continue, to trace the shape of this entanglement. The young man seemed relieved to speak openly, the confession itself a form of release. He said he was torn between the intoxicating pull of the affair and the gnawing awareness that he was hurting a man he'd never met. "She seems unhappy in her marriage," Thomas offered, as if seeking justification, "but she never speaks ill of him. She just says he's absent, distracted, someone who no longer notices her presence." During the session, Thomas revealed he had tried to distance himself several times, deleting her number, ignoring her calls, but all it took was a single message, a simple, "Are you okay?" for him to capitulate entirely. "I've never felt so seen, doctor," he confessed, his voice cracking. "Even knowing this thing has an expiration date, I can't let it go." Michael kept his attention focused, his expression a mask of professional neutrality. It was a delicate situation, but not a rare one. Extramarital affairs were emotionally complex, and he had heard countless variations of this story before. What made this day different was the sheer emotional intensity in Thomas's voice. There was an overwhelming sense of being consumed, of a fire burning too brightly, too quickly. And there was something else, a strange, unsettling familiarity in the terms Thomas used. The way he described their meetings, the words the woman spoke, even a particular turn of phrase. He mentioned a small, independent cinema they both loved, the one that played old black and white films. He described her favorite coffee order, a black Americano with a single packet of raw sugar. But for Michael, it was still too fragmented for any conclusion. His professional mind dismissed it as clinical projection, the tendency to see patterns where none existed. He was dealing with a vulnerable patient, and his duty was to create a safe space for Thomas to process his feelings, to become aware of the consequences, and perhaps find a healthier path. Near the end of the session, Thomas said something that snagged in Michael's mind. "These meetings with her, they make me feel something so rare, genuine listening. With her, I don't have to pretend. She sees me for who I really am." This statement hung in the air, a quiet echo of something Michael had heard before in a different context, a long time ago. The session ended with a sincere thank you from Thomas. He seemed lighter, his shoulders less slumped. As he left, he turned at the door. "I truly hope I can do the right thing," he said, and for the first time, Michael felt a sliver of doubt about what Thomas considered the right thing to be. Michael remained for a few long seconds, staring at the closed door. It was as if something inside him had been activated, a low hum of unease without a clear form. The story had moved him, not for its details, but for the raw, consuming emotion of the patient. He felt intrigued, not with jealousy or anger, not yet, but with a vague sensation that there were more layers to this story than what had been told that morning. He continued his day, seeing other patients, but the image of Thomas describing this woman returned like a persistent echo. Michael was an experienced professional. He knew that sometimes clinical intuition captures what reason has not yet understood. And on that Thursday, he felt something was taking shape, even if he didn't yet know what it was. The next day, Thomas arrived for another session as if nothing had changed. He greeted the receptionist with a discreet smile and sat in the waiting room, calmly flipping through a magazine. The clock on the wall marked the hour with a quiet tick, each sound measuring out the seconds before Michael's world would be irrevocably fractured. When Michael opened the door, his expression was more serious than usual, the unsettling echoes from the previous day having coalesced into a quiet storm of apprehension. He nodded for Thomas to enter. This time, the conversation didn't begin with the usual questions. Thomas seemed more composed, almost reflective. "I've been thinking a lot about everything we discussed," he began, settling into the chair. "I'm tired of living this hidden life. Maybe it's time to put an end to it." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window. Or maybe not, because a part of me still wants to fight for it. Michael just listened, his jaw clenched. He felt a strange premonition, a cold certainty that he was standing on the edge of a precipice. Then, Thomas said the words that changed everything. "Yesterday, I dreamt about Jennifer," he said, his tone casual, nostalgic. "She was in the same cafe where we first met. She was wearing that blue dress, the same one from the night she told me her marriage was cold." He smiled faintly, lost in the memory. "Jennifer Reynolds is an incredible woman, doctor. She made me believe in love again." Jennifer Reynolds. The air around Michael seemed to vanish, sucked out of the room in a silent, violent rush. There was no doubt now, no room for professional rationalizations or clinical distance. The first name had been a chilling coincidence. The last name was a verdict. Thomas hadn't just described her favorite coffee or the cinema she loved. He knew her. He knew her full name, and he was saying it inside this office, speaking of her as if she were a stranger to the man sitting across from him. Slowly, deliberately, Michael stood up. The worn leather of his chair groaned in protest. He walked to the door, his movements stiff, robotic. He opened it without a word and waited, his hand gripping the cold brass knob. Thomas looked up, his expression shifting from reverie to confusion. Did I say something wrong?" Michael answered without looking at him, his voice a flat, dead thing. "The session is over, and it will be our last." Thomas hesitated, his mouth slightly agape, then grabbed his coat and walked out, glancing back as if trying to decipher a language he didn't understand. The moment the door clicked shut, Michael turned to his secretary. "Cancel all my appointments for the day," he commanded, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. He went back into his office, locked the door, and stood there for long minutes, his hands resting on the polished surface of his desk, his knuckles white. There was no more room for analysis. The truth had been thrown onto the floor of his sanctuary, raw and unfiltered. At dusk, he went home. The light in the living room was on, casting a warm, deceptive glow. Jennifer was on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, pretending everything was normal. The sight of her, so calm, so oblivious to the storm that had just broken over his head, filled him with a cold, quiet rage. He entered and stood there, observing her for a few seconds. "Thomas Baker has therapy with me," he said. The words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the finality of a judge's sentence. Jennifer's phone clattered to the floor. She froze, her face paling, as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. It took her a few seconds to react, to form a word. "What?" "You heard me." She put her hands to her face and a sob tore from her throat. She tried to approach him, her hands outstretched, but he took a sharp step back, creating a chasm between them that felt as wide as a canyon. "How long has this been going on?" His voice was firm, unforgiving. "Michael, please." "How long, Jennifer?" She hesitated, took a deep breath, and then broke down. "For 3 months," she whispered, the words choked with tears. "It started by accident. Then, it got harder to stop. I didn't plan any of this, I swear." Michael didn't respond. He crossed the hallway in silence, went to their bedroom, and opened the closet. He grabbed a backpack and began stuffing clothes into it, with methodical, angry movements. Wallet, phone, keys. He returned to the living room. Jennifer was crying against the wall, her body shaking with sobs, without the strength to stop him. "Are you really leaving like this?" she pleaded. He replied without looking at her, his hand already on the front doorknob. "Nothing you say now will change this." He left. He closed the door slowly, deliberately, without another word, the soft click echoing the end of their life together. Minutes later, still trembling, Jennifer picked up her phone and called Thomas. When he answered, the words tumbled out in a frantic rush. "Are you crazy? You went to therapy with my husband?" There was a stunned silence on the other end. Then, Thomas's voice, filled with disbelief. "What? Your husband is Dr. Reynolds?" "Yes." "Oh my God," he breathed. "That explains everything. Now I understand why he suddenly sent me away." She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to hold back a fresh wave of tears. "Did you tell him? Did you tell him what you talked about in therapy?" Another silence, longer this time, heavy with implication. "Did you tell him, Thomas?" "Yes." The voice on the other end finally admitted, small and broken. "He knows." Time passed, but the wound didn't heal. It festered. The silence between Michael and Jennifer became a legal distance, formalized by retainer agreements and the cold, impersonal language of divorce proceedings. Their lawyers spoke before either of them had the courage to exchange a single word. The apartment was gradually emptied, its contents divided by sterile lists. What had once been a shared routine Sunday mornings with the newspaper, quiet evenings with a bottle of wine became formalities in court documents. There was nothing left to discuss. Everything had already been said or destroyed through the choices they had made. Just when Michael thought the worst was over, a new bomb arrived by mail. It was a crisp, white envelope, his name and address printed in bold, black letters. Official. Inside, the ground trembled beneath his feet again. Thomas Baker had filed a lawsuit against him for moral damages, claiming a catastrophic breach of therapeutic confidentiality. The document was a clinical, brutal assault on his professional life. It cited specific sections of the American Psychological Association's ethics code, pointing out that the patient, Thomas Baker, had shared intimate, vulnerable information in a protected therapeutic environment. It alleged that this information had been used against him outside the session for the therapist's personal benefit. The lawsuit also referenced the fictional Federal Mental Health Privacy Protection Act, MHPPA, stating that Dr. Reynolds had violated federal psychological privacy rights. Michael felt the familiar sensation of the air being sucked out of the room. He had lost his wife. Now he risked losing his career. His reputation, built over 2 decades with unwavering dedication and ethical rigor, was about to be publicly questioned and potentially dismantled. And all of it because of a relationship that should never have existed. For days, he hesitated. He could settle, accept the lawsuit in silence, pay a fine, and let the scandal fade with time, avoid the exposure. But when he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he saw a man who had already lost too much. A quiet, defiant anger began to burn through the fog of his grief. He would not go down without a fight. He decided to act. He filed a civil suit against Thomas Baker, based on the state law protecting the sanctity of the marital pact. His lawyer argued that the patient had not been a passive victim. He had directly and consciously interfered in Michael's marriage, causing irreversible emotional damage and demonstrating malicious intent. This wasn't just infidelity, it was the deliberate, calculated destruction of a commitment that had lasted for years. From that point on, everything turned into a dirty war. It was a war fought not with weapons, but with depositions, subpoenas, and character assassinations. Both legal teams began dissecting every detail of the relationships. They searched old emails, text messages, medical records, meeting dates, call histories, and personal agendas were laid bare. Jennifer was called to testify. The full, embarrassing scope of her affair was formally exposed in the reports attached to the case. Her private pain, her secret messages, her justifications all became public record. Exhibit A in a battle she never wanted to fight. The respected therapist, Dr. Michael Reynolds, was now the central figure in a double scandal, marital and professional. Thomas, meanwhile, became the center of public accusations. He was painted as a manipulative homewrecker, a man who had not only destroyed a family, but had also perversely manipulated his own therapy sessions for emotional gain. What had once been a private crisis, confined to the walls of a therapy room in a suburban home, had now become a sprawling, ugly dispute involving dozens of pages, signatures, and deadlines. Their pain was no longer their own. It was documentation, protocol, and expert analysis. Justice was at stake, but somewhere along the way, the humanity had been stripped from it. The raw, messy truth of each person was being confronted in a sterile arena without any emotional protection. It was no longer a lawsuit. It was the public demolition of 3 lives. During the months the cases dragged through the courts, each of them followed a silent path of isolation, as if the scandal had placed them in separate, invisible cages where the only sound was the echo of their own choices. What had once been a personal crisis had now become a battlefield, legal, emotional, and public. And on this battlefield, there were no innocents, only survivors trying to hide the damage. Jennifer left Boston 2 weeks after the formal separation was filed. She left behind the apartment, the furniture that held the imprint of their shared years, and even the collection of potted orchids she had meticulously cared for on the balcony. She fled to Denver, to her older sister, Ashley, who welcomed her with an open embrace and the quiet wisdom not to ask questions. At first, Jennifer tried to maintain a semblance of routine. She helped with her nieces and nephews, herded them to school, and went to the market. She read entire books in 2 days, losing herself in other people's fictional tragedies to escape her own. But at night, when the house fell silent, the weight of her reality would return, crushing her. She relived every clandestine conversation with Thomas, every carefully constructed excuse she had given Michael, every time she had looked in the mirror and decided to delay the truth, out of fear of losing what little was left. She wanted to call Michael every day, to explain, to apologize, to scream. But shame spoke louder, a constant grating voice in her head. Regret had already settled in as a permanent guest within her. Thomas, too, withdrew from the world. He quit his job at the advertising agency, his creative spark extinguished. He deactivated his social media accounts, his online presence vanishing overnight. He cut ties with mutual friends, unable to face their questioning glances or silent judgments. Trapped in his own apartment, the days began to blur into a monotonous cycle of waking and sleeping. The infectious enthusiasm he once brought to every new idea, every conversation, had disappeared, drained by a guilt he pretended not to feel. He started taking sleeping pills to quiet his mind, and soon he was taking them just to exist. He had recurring nightmares where he relived the last session with Michael. He saw the therapist's face, the slow dawning of realization, the flicker of professional calm being consumed by raw, personal agony, the final, cold look of dismissal. It was as if that man's face had become permanently etched in his mind, a constant, searing reminder that even though he had claimed ignorance, he knew. Deep down, he knew he was crossing a dangerous, unforgivable line. He had just chosen to ignore it. And Michael, who had always been the man of reason, of discipline and restraint, finally collapsed internally. He tried to keep seeing his patients, to maintain the same steady, balanced posture that had defined his career. He sat in his leather chair, listened to their stories of pain and loss, but his eyes no longer reflected security. They reflected his own loss. One day, while listening to a patient talk about the hollow ache of emotional abandonment, he felt his own body begin to shake uncontrollably. His hands trembled. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. After the session ended, he turned off his phone and spent more than an hour staring into the empty space where his patient had sat. It was on that day that he realized he needed help. He, the healer, was deeply wounded. He sought out a therapist in a neighboring town, a stranger to whom he was just another name on a schedule, hoping to avoid the comments and judgments of his own professional community. The therapist Michael found was a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, whose office was stark and minimalist, a stark contrast to his own warm, book-lined sanctuary. It felt foreign, which was exactly what he needed. In the first sessions, he just breathed. He spoke in clipped, clinical terms, describing the events as if he were presenting a case study. He was the wrong party, the victim of a dual betrayal. Doctor. Sharma listened patiently, her silence, a mirror he wasn't yet ready to look into. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He talked about the marriage, about the quiet pride he felt in keeping things working, in maintaining a stable, predictable life. He talked about how much he believed their secure routine was enough, a sturdy vessel to carry them through life. And then, prodded by Dr. Sharma's gentle, insightful questions, he began to admit what he had always hidden, even from himself. He admitted that he had distanced himself from Jennifer long before Thomas Baker appeared. He had become a spectator of his own marital life. He would come home from a day of dissecting other people's emotions, feeling drained and empty, with nothing left to give his own wife. He had traded the messy, demanding role of a husband for the controlled, detached role of an emotional technician. He fixed problems at work, at home. He simply expected things to function. "It may seem absurd," he said one afternoon, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "but part of me understands why she sought in another man what I had failed to offer." He looked at Dr. Sharma, expecting judgment, but saw only compassionate understanding. And even understanding it doesn't lessen the pain. "No," she said softly, "understanding and pain can coexist. The truth has the power to illuminate, but it also burns." That phrase, "it also burns," stayed with him. He felt its searing heat. One day, sitting alone in a generic cafe downtown, nursing a cup of bitter coffee, he overheard a conversation from the table next to him. An elderly woman was speaking to her friend, her voice frail but clear. "Love doesn't die," she said, stirring her tea. "We're just the ones who forget to feed it." The simple, homespun wisdom of the phrase struck Michael with the force of a physical blow. He finished his coffee, paid the bill, and walked for blocks without direction, repeating the phrase in his mind like an involuntary mantra. We forget to feed it. For the first time, he had the courage to admit the full, unvarnished truth to himself. The marriage had already begun to crumble, long before Thomas Baker appeared. He and Jennifer had been living in the beautiful, hollowed-out shell of what they once had. They were two people sharing a space, but no longer a life. The affair wasn't the cause of the fire. It was just the spark that ignited the tinder that had been accumulating for years. His absence, his emotional withdrawal, his quiet assumption that everything was fine simply because nothing was overtly wrong, that was the tinder. The realization brought no comfort, only a profound, bottomless sadness. He had been so focused on Jennifer's betrayal that he had failed to see his own. The trial, when it finally came, seemed more like a closing ceremony than a legal dispute. All three of them, Michael, Thomas, and Jennifer, were exhausted, hollowed out by the months of accusations and exposures. They were like ghosts, haunting the polished wood and sterile air of the courtroom. After hearing the final arguments, the judge, a weary-looking woman in her late 50s, delivered her decision. It was, as Michael had expected, an intermediate position. She acknowledged that Dr. Reynolds had allowed his personal life to catastrophically affect his professional neutrality and imposed a symbolic fine for misconduct, but she did not revoke his license. His years of dedicated service, she noted, could not be entirely erased by one profound lapse in judgment. On the other hand, she also recognized Thomas Baker's active responsibility for his role in the affair, ordering him to pay compensation for emotional manipulation and interference. It wasn't about the money, it was about the formal assignment of blame. When it was all over, Jennifer remained seated in the back row of the courtroom. People were leaving, their hushed conversations filling the vast space. But she stayed, her head bowed, looking at her hands as if they were the only things that still belonged to her. Later that evening, Michael returned to the old apartment to collect the last of his things. The air was stale, the rooms filled with an unfamiliar emptiness. Everything there seemed smaller, stranger, as if time had passed differently over the furniture. He opened a drawer in the bedroom dresser, rummaged through some old things, and found the small velvet box where they stored their wedding rings. He took one of them out and looked at the engraved interior. The date of their wedding, a promise made on a sun-drenched afternoon 2 decades ago. Without thinking, he whispered into the silent room, "That was a promise." He felt the weight of the years, the weight of all the small unsaid things, the moments of turning away instead of turning toward, and every broken promise demands its price. He closed the box and put it back in the drawer. No tears fell. He had already cried enough in the silent confines of Dr. Sharma's office. He had grieved the man he was, the husband he failed to be, and the future he had lost. Life would go on. He would continue to practice, but with a different skin, a different, more somber awareness. Jennifer would rebuild her life in a new city. Thomas would eventually emerge from his self-imposed prison, but they would all carry the scars. As he stood in the empty living room for the last time, Michael finally understood the deepest truth of his tragedy. The greatest betrayal hadn't been Jennifer sleeping with another man, or Thomas manipulating his therapy, or even his own professional failure. The greatest betrayal was the one he and Jennifer had committed together, day by day, in slow, imperceptible increments. It was the betrayal against the fragile, living thing they had vowed to take care of, and had instead let die from neglect, without even realizing it was starving.